This is Let's Talk with Hart Hagan. Today I'm joined by attorney Vince Heuser. Vince, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fine, Hart. Thanks for asking me to come on.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So we were going to talk about a couple of topics. Racism was one, and the other, we might get to the Federal Reserve. So the reason I chose racism is because the last time we talked, it seemed like there were maybe some issues there that could provide fertile ground for discussion. Do you have any initial thoughts, or should I start?
You can go ahead. That's fine. I'll kind of collect as you talk.
Okay. So racism comes to mind because obviously we've got a lot going on in our country. We've got the protests, we've got Black Lives Matter, we've got issues with police violence, and there are varying perspectives on that. If you get me started on race, get me started on any issue, I like to back up to the 50,000 foot view and say, you know, big picture, what is the cause of all this that is sometimes ignored in the public discourse? And, you know, when I think of racism, I think of, we have a country that was founded on, you know, the slavery was a source of a great deal of wealth early on. So we have a country in which we're, in my opinion, we're in denial about genocide and slavery. We're sitting on land that was stolen from indigenous peoples, sometimes under the cruelest of circumstances. And this didn't, to say the least, didn't always make it into our history books. And slavery, the wealth that was produced from slavery is often ignored as far as a reason for our success. And the other thing, the reason that I want to get into this is that, you know, that there's interpersonal racism and then there's systemic racism. And I think, I can't speak for everybody, but I think most people, most white people have made an effort to get past the interpersonal racism. And when they're accused of being racist, sometimes they're defensive because it's like, what else can I do? Meanwhile, you have media and you have systemic racism in the media, in government, in business. You have a prison system and a criminal justice system that exhibits systemic racism, to say the least. And those are, you know, the media is often quiet about that because business has a lot of money to make out of the systemic racism in our, we have a prison industrial complex. We literally have prison slave labor in our society. And people of color are disproportionately impacted. In my understanding, in my opinion, people of color are disproportionately impacted by incarceration and by you know, things like stop and frisk and over policing. So I think those things are real, and they're real irrespective of whether people have racism at the personal level. So I've pretty much exhausted everything I have to say about that, and I welcome your comments, but has anything I've said, have I made sense on anything so far? Is there
Well,
you want to talk about?
I have more questions than answers,
sure,
maybe.
Sure.
And so, you know, the in denial and this cause is ignored in the public discourse. The accusation of racism, interpersonal and systemic, is interesting. I guess my first few questions would be, have you ever owned a slave? And I think, Hart, your answer to that would be no. And then I'd say, have you ever driven a native off his land? And I think your answer to that would be no. We in human society have some means of bringing peace, some means of bringing closure. The justice system, the courts, civil or criminal, are an opportunity to have a reasonable way to bring closure to disputes. Another thing that we do in the legislature is called a statute of limitations. And so your allegation of systemic racism or even interpersonal, you didn't say it, but generational, some people say, I think rings a little hollow. And I think the reason I say that is we're not a feuding society. We're not the Hatfields and the McCoys. We don't go back generations to dig up crimes to shoot each other over. At least we ought not. And I think rational people don't do that. And so if we allow people to go back even before existing lifetimes, and the statute against perpetuities is a concept in the law that Kentucky recently got rid of, but the idea that you can't create something that lasts forever, and closure and renewal is a part of progress in human society. But we hear so many voices just absolutely glued to their narrative that we have to go back forever and resolve every single dispute. And I think, first of all, that's impossible and kind of utopian. And second of all, I think it just creates constant turmoil and uproar when we don't, encourage peace, and instead we encourage violent overthrow of systems we don't like. And that's just an introduction. I think we have to, forgive and move on at some point. Now, if there were current systemic racism, then I'd say, okay, we got something to talk about. But to go back, pre-Civil War is, frankly, kind of a waste of listener time and maybe even our time. I think we need to talk about what's going on in the here and now. And you brought up the media and the prison and criminal justice system and the business bias and all that sort of stuff. And I think that plays into an interesting narrative here, because the radio station we're on, WFMP, itself declares in its policies that we discriminate on the basis of race. And it's the narrative that introduces is not eliminating racism, it's creating counter-racism. So I think we hear like this, the whole thing about the Confederate flag and about these Confederate monuments. Yes, that's in the here and now, and we can talk about these things. But what do they mean to people really? They mean to most people most white people that I've ever talked to, and I'm not a big Confederate fan or whatever, but they mean rebel, as in the whiskey Rebel Yell, right? And they mean I'm free and I'm independent and I, blah blah blah, and I will not be oppressed. But that's exactly what black movements today, some at least, are seeking, to rebel against the unjust systems that we face right now. So instead of turning it into class warfare, as some would have us do, don't we need to seek a kind of communion, a kind of unity in overcoming oppressive systems? And yeah, when you called me, I brought up the Federal Reserve System, and frankly, it's an archetype of oppressive systems, and it's one in which progressives and conservatives can join together in spades to get rid of, because that's a class war between people who control banking and the rest of the society. And so we really do need to do a show on that. We need to talk about that. But at the moment with this racism, if you look at the statistics, and U.S. News and World Report did a story on this back in 2017. Give me a minute. Something about race and murder or homicide in the United States, and they did a statistics and some charts and all that, and there were some things that they said they were unhappily surprised by. those things are the crime rates among the various races, and the interactions between the races. And an interesting thing that I think ought to concern us in this discussion is that they had a chart that showed that blacks kill whites 3 times as much as whites kill blacks, and that all by itself ought to be very concerning when blacks make up 20% of the population, or 13 or 15 or whatever, depending on what part of the country you're in. Whites, 80 plus, and
Vince, I'm going to let you continue, but now or later, I mean, can you send me a link to that so I can read?
Oh, sure. You can Google it. Just
Yeah.
Google U.S. News
Okay.
and race homicide 2017. I was Googling something closely related to that after our last show and came across this. So it's like, okay. Now, so the point here, if I have a point as a conservative, it is that we as humans, what?
I said big if. No, I'm kidding.
Okay, no, we like swipes,
Yeah.
but it is that the human family ought to be more important than the particular tribes, the particular race, and frankly even particular classes, to the extent we can avoid it. And that was what the American experiment was supposed to be about. Yes, I will concede your point that much of what was done, especially in the South, by imprisoned, unjustly held human beings, and that legacy is something of a shame to America. But I think we've repented of it all the way back to when I was a child watching Martin Luther King and my own father in the riots here in Louisville. So Martin Luther King, not in Louisville. He did come, but mostly he was on national TV. And listening to things that, I have a dream that one day will be judged, my children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but the character, but the content of their character. And now the other day, with all this stuff going on, a professor, and I forget where this is, I don't think it's the California guy, used that quote or one similar from Martin Luther King, and he's being sanctioned for quoting Dr. Martin Luther King. And because blacks are offended, not because whites are offended. And this is out of control. This is unproductive. And the different groups that are out for the common man or the black man or whatever aren't necessarily so. Black Lives Matter is very pro-abortion. That's one of their platform things. You go down to the abortion clinic here in Louisville, and about half the people going in are black. And so you ask, if people are out because Black Lives Matter, one guy in Minneapolis can cause hundreds, even thousands of people to hit the streets and destroy buildings, how come we murder 50 or so black babies a week and nobody cares? You got very few black people show up in protest at the abortion clinic. That's almost a white province. If some blacks, I mean, there's 2 black men are employed by the abortion clinic right now to bring girls in to make sure that the sidewalk counselors don't talk them out of it. And these black men escorting black women and their boyfriends, lovers, whoever happen to be exploiting them today, in to kill a child, and no blacks. Well, there are a few. I take that back. There are a few that care, but it's a white province, and that's a shame. The same problem happens in black families that other than just with abortion, but black men allowing black women to be exploited or even engaging in it sometimes, or acting irresponsibly and not taking responsibility for their lives, their families, their situation, just moving from pleasure to pleasure. As a conservative, that doesn't make any sense. Principles matter, social structure matters, and an improvement of that situation, I think, would improve everything else. And when we look to government to provide that improvement, I think we expect too much. It's not the role of government it's the role of government to govern not to hand out benefits. And I think there is a problem in the progressive conservative divide, that progressives think that men with guns ought to come and take money from people who have it and give it to the people that they think deserve more favor, like for the case of WFMP, gender identity, what are the other things in the policy statement? And a lot of people don't think that's the way it ought to be. So our conversation can touch on all these things, but I guess to summarize everything I got, it is that there isn't really a glass ceiling anymore. There isn't really the oppression that's being claimed anymore. There are affirmative action mandates. There are sensitivities trainings. There are the outrage of mostly liberal communities when somebody says something conservative like what Dr. Martin Luther King said. And there are great men, great black men who have achieved a great deal simply because they chose not to be an oppressed victim. Clarence Thomas, Justice of the Supreme Court, conservative guy, but black man, pushed and worked hard and climbed the ladder, just like everybody else. The premier example in modern times is Barack Obama. While I disagree with a lot of his policies, he was a black president of the United States, not for one term, but for 2 terms. And yet Black Lives Matter and all our progressive friends are going around yelling, racism, systemic, every police are all racist. And that just that's not the reality. Walter Williams, Alan Keyes, Thomas Sowell, women, Dr. Carol Swain, Alveda King. These are great black people who have decided to give up their victim status and achieve. I think that's the recipe for success. I think that's the recipe for abating the racial dissension, the racial conflict. And I think those who have a different economic worldview, meaning socialists, want to promote class warfare in order to gain power. And so in that sense, this ain't about racism. It is about power. So how do we fix it, Hart?
How do we fix which part?
All of it, of course. I think we start in the black community, the black churches, the black families, to enable and engage them to take responsibility, to learn responsibility, to not feel like a victim all the time. And I think we have come a long way since I was a child in using the powers of government to address racism. And if you think for a second that you can take one cop who's overexcited and turn that into every white person hates blacks, I think your thinking isn't clear. A lot of people are saying things like this. This is not about white racism. It might be about police procedures, as you and I talked about last time we talked. But those things are addressed properly through government and training and weeding out the bad guys. Nothing wrong with weeding out the bad guys. But I think creating outrage and trying a judicial case in the public media is not really the way to fix the problems.
Okay. We're nearly 20 minutes into this, and that's great. I'm really, I'm happy that you could speak at length and fairly eloquently about where you're coming from. Give me a few minutes to develop a couple of points, okay?
Sure.
I want to, real quick, I want to say, you mentioned sensitivity training and affirmative action. I'm of the belief that while those things are not without merit, they sometimes cause they sometimes cause needless controversy, partly because it's it's blaming things on interpersonal racism while there's still systemic racism. So, but let me go back to the beginning. I talked about genocide denial, denial about genocide and slavery. One way this comes into play, well, let me just say that that stuff is not in the past, it's in the present. I used to be a conservative, and not to say I'm smarter than anybody or more informed than anybody, but I used to have that viewpoint. And when I had that viewpoint, I thought, okay, slavery is in the past. What are you going to do? The dispossession of Native Americans from their land is in the past. There's only so much you can do for that. We have to forgive. We have to move on. I thought all those things. The reason, but okay, so let's ask you and me, in these conversations, we're going to get to know each other's worldview and each other's agenda, even if it might be hard to articulate at first. But or if you ask me my main concerns about the world that we live in, what's the end game? What are the goals here? I would say that survival is one of the main goals. Wouldn't you agree that survival is like one of the main things that we should be planning for?
Well, if we were animals, I guess that would be true, or maybe I should say, if we were only animals, that would be true. But I think we're rational and in a category slightly different, and more importantly, I think that the Greeks at least believed that we had a spiritual nature, and that got, of course, brought in with the history of the Jews as to what that means, and the Greeks had developed the concept of a higher power, which they even had a monument called the Unknown God, who was the all-powerful one, and so we live in the West. I think we live in a Christian worldview primarily, and the fact that you even brought up the concept of an endgame here has certain smacks of a certain Christian worldview, I guess. But the solution might be to live a more rational life rather than just survival. And so who was it? Was it Seneca or Socrates that said the unexamined life is not worth living? That's where we can think ahead of just where's our next meal coming from, except to the extent maybe that the Federal Reserve makes us all bankrupt, and so we have to wonder where our next meal is coming from.
Right. So
we're trying to rise above the mammon, the money, and work toward some rational, higher worldview. That I think, and so I don't buy the concept that survival is all we can talk about, or even the first thing to talk about. And I certainly don't buy the concept that we have to revisit every past wrong and make it present today. So I think we take each other where we are. We stand face to face, and in my own business dealings, I had a partner who's passed away, God rest his soul, David Peppers, and we worked on some business things, and a black man, a very strongly opinionated black man, and frankly, we were, best of friends, got each other's back kind of a thing. And you don't find very many friends like that in life. I have maybe one or two others have had, but I agree with you that the problem is not personal racism. And if we talk about systemic racism, I think we have to be careful that we're not bringing the past forward inappropriately or unnecessarily. And let's look at each other. What is it they say? Mano a mano, man to man, hand to hand, face to face, and work toward solving problems. And so 81 blacks were killed in Nigeria in the last week, and no black American has said a single word about it. Do black lives really matter? And like I said before, the abortion clinic, half the people going in on a what was it y'all said the percentage in Louisville was? I think it was Rolfe that maybe said 13%. I think it might be closer to 20, but all these black babies are killed. Planned Parenthood was founded by Margaret Sanger, and if you go back and look, part of the reason was to reduce the population of minorities. These are things that ought to be decried in every community, but especially in this community where we have a brand new place opened to eliminate some of the races, and we don't talk about that. That is systemic racism.
Okay, we've been in this a half hour, and it's been almost all you. I need some time. Okay.
Sure.
Okay, so this idea of we should focus on the present, not the past. To me, genocide and slavery are things that are occurring in the present. And if one of the main set of facts that supports my current progressive views is I wish people knew the true history and the true present of the United States. How the United States, military does not go around the world defending freedom and democracy. It goes around the world enforcing fascism more than anything else.
Yeah, that's more the CIA than the military, but okay.
It's both.
Yeah.
So there's to me, there's racism in the present, and there's genocide in the present. To me, the Iraq War was genocide, the Vietnam War was genocide, and the overwhelming thrust of American foreign policy is racist and imperialistic. It's unjust, and since 1945, in my view, there has not been a just war. There have only been wars of aggression. And we spend all this money on arms, many of which don't even work, but that's another question.
It's another show.
Yeah, we could probably agree on a lot of the, wasteful
a lot of it.
spending.
I agree with you on U.S. foreign policy. I mean, drone strikes under the Obama administration, we were doing a drone strike a day or more, and I don't know that as much of that continues today, but I think maybe they solved all their perceived problems. I don't know, but there's no denying that American foreign policy needs an overhaul. Go ahead.
So when I said survival is an end game, I certainly agree with you that survival is not the only thing that we should be working toward, but survival is kind of you can't thrive unless you survive. And a lot of the things that are the same things that are threatening our survival are also keeping people from thriving in the present. On the climate report, I say that the three foremost threats to our survival are climate change and the sixth mass extinction and nuclear war. They're not the only threats to our survival, but they are those things. They're problems that present a substantial risk, if not an overwhelming risk, to our very survival. And they're not being addressed by our current system. So we should agree that I know that you value your children and your progeny, and that having a rational way forward. So to me, it's like, why am I bringing this up? To me, it's like, show me a system or a proposal that increases our chances for survival. Show me something that addresses those problems that are posing a very threat to our survival. And it's those same systems that oppress people in the present. It's those same systems that caused the death of 200,000 people in Guatemala in the 4 decades following Eisenhower's overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz. Time after time, you have.
Wait a minute, I got lost.
No, okay, well.
The 200,000, that doesn't have anything to do with climate change, mass extinction, or nuclear war. That has to do with U.S. policy.
Yeah, Yeah, it's the
Okay.
same.
All right. Fine.
The same
Yep.
kind of policy of dominating other countries. There are people who defend the Vietnam War as we were fighting socialism or fighting communism. There's so many facts that get missed in the mix there because we
Oh
weren't.
yeah. Could not agree with you more.
Okay, great. So I say that genocide and racism are in the present. And it's not just in the past. So that's, and the same genocide and racism that that I object to on grounds of justice is also posing a threat to our very existence. So I'm trying to critique and oppose a system that should be of concern to everybody, but is not a concern to everybody because of either ideological reasons or because people in our education system and in our media, people are not taught the facts of the matter, the bare facts of the matter. And here's one proof of that. There's a historian, his name might escape me, Peter Kuznets, who polled his own students. He teaches, he was polling like some of the best and the brightest students. And he does these informal polls that are maybe not what you would call scientific polls, but he's asking the best and the brightest students, how many Vietnamese died in the Vietnam War? And the average answer he gets is 100,000. So when the true answer, if you look at all three countries involved in that conflict, and if you look at all the causes of death, I mean, you're talking about 5 million people or so. If you just look at the number of Vietnamese who died or the number of Vietnamese soldiers, then you might see figures of 1 million, 2 million, something like that. But in either event, so it's like the best and the brightest kids don't even have, they're off by a factor of 30. So that's one thing that I offer.
Yeah, the CIA had, in fact, John F. Kennedy had the president of South Vietnam basically assassinated.
Yeah, right.
When he was on the edge of solving the conflict.
Mm-hmm.
They had developed a technique to protect the farmers from the guerrillas, and it was working when they took him out. Your military industrial complex argument, I think, was plainly active in that moment.
Yeah. So bringing it a little bit closer to home, I heard something on one of the talking heads on cable news recently talked about people not wanting that we shouldn't, that our economic system is not based on handouts. And that it's like, what if we're sitting on stolen land? What is that but a handout? You know, you had people being.
Yeah, but wait a minute, I ain't buying it. Stolen land. The statute of limitations point human peace. You can go back. You didn't create any of the land, Hart. Neither did I. None of us owns the land. The land belongs to God, or Gaia, or whoever you worship. Or nobody for that matter. And if you don't, then it is a case of might makes right. So if there's no higher authority or higher moral code, then I take what I want and we're done. And I kill you if you get in the way. So go ahead. You're appealing to a higher moral authority.
No, I think I was just, I was trying to develop the idea that the significance of, let me frame it this way. Okay, let's talk for a minute about redistribution of wealth. So I'm getting a little bit lost here because I need to be able to talk for a few minutes without interruption like I do you. I think redistribution of wealth is ongoing. Like you say with the Fed, that the government is involved in the project of redistributing wealth. That the government redistributes wealth upwards. And there are, innumerable instances of redistribution of wealth on an ongoing, in the past and in the present, on an ongoing basis. The government is involved in redistributing wealth. And so to object to redistributing wealth is, I think, missing some of the relevant facts of the matter. And I think that, denial of genocide is relevant to that.
Well,
one more thing. It has to do with what are the founding myths of our country? What are I call fairy tales, but every people has a mythology. And what is our mythology? And is our mythology based on truth, or is it more based on fiction?
Everybody's built on a myth, and is it based on truth? Self-fulfilling prophecy or self-answering question or something. The redistribution thing you were talking about, Trump and the Treasury just handed out piles of money, and they've been doing it on an ongoing basis, but they're doing it in little chunks at the bottom, and some folks got $1,200. I listened to a guy this morning on the sidewalk downtown that he got $600 and supposed to get another $600, but the check has been delayed. And then when you move up the ladder, the Treasury is giving taxpayer guarantees to the Federal Reserve loans to the banks, where $1,200 to the little guy and trillions of dollars to the big guys. So allowing the Federal Reserve to do this with taxpayer backing, and the Federal Reserve is a private corporation, I'm sure you know that, but there is a Federal Reserve Board that's a government agency that oversees the Federal Reserve Bank. But the trillions of dollars going in at the top to bail out Wall Street and the banks is not matched by the hundreds of dollars going in at the bottom to help the people suffering from what would be a depression. Although Trump's effort at that, frankly, is a step in the right direction. But the redistribution is not something the government ought to be doing at all. The process of governing means making the rules of the game. It doesn't mean taking away the cookies from some people and giving them to other people. That is, as the scholastics would teach, theft. You're taking unjustly. So we can take the money that we need to protect our country. We can take the money we need to build roads, to maintain a mail delivery system, or even the internet to the poor people in the farmlands. Those things are all sort of monopoly type stuff that community services that the government can be involved in and should be. But just confiscating somebody's wealth by taxes that are used to pay other people benefits is wrong. We need to make a system where those people can flourish. That is one of the ends of the economy, human flourishing, human leisure, instead of having oppressive systems where they got piles of paperwork to spend all their time on, taking whatever they've earned and giving it to people who don't work or don't earn. And I am not saying we don't care for widows and orphans. I am saying that we make rules that make it beneficial for everybody to care for widows and orphans. But as it is, we have this very oppressive system of tax and spend, of confiscate and redistribute, when we really should be saying, look, you get a 2-for-1 tax deduction, Mr. Businessman, for every dollar in wages that you pay. And therefore, your best tax advantage is to have a bunch of high wage earners. That's the way we make rules. And I don't know why we don't hear that discussion very much. And, I scan the radio dials. I don't do the television thing, but none of the conversations on the left or the right address these particular things.
Well, okay, so let me talk about redistributing wealth for a minute. Can I do that without interruption? We have a few minutes left, and you've had most of the time.
Okay.
Okay. So you seem to be saying that I just think redistribution of wealth is deeply entrenched. It's hard for me to imagine a system that does not redistribute wealth systemically and on a large scale, but it does it in the wrong direction. It suffocates the many and enriches the few. Now, let me, you talked about we need a military that protects our country. I would say that, we could reduce our military by 90% and still protect our country plenty well. And and the military is a mechanism for redistributing wealth upwards. Here's how that works. Most of the technology that we have is a result of defense spending. It didn't have to be, but it is. The defense spending is a way of scaring people to death so that you trick them into putting all this money into the military. And that results in the computer technology that we have. And similarly, government spending has resulted in much of the medical technology that we have. But truly, the technology that we get from military spending has revolutionized our economy, not in the most efficient way, because if we want to revolutionize our economy and provide for technology, we can do it in ways where you don't have to trick and deceive people. But the result of it is a systematic and large-scale redistribution of wealth upwards on an ongoing basis, because the people who own, for one thing, people who own defense stocks are being enriched. For another thing, you have these spin-off applications. I mean, Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple, they wouldn't exist in their present form if they hadn't used technology that was developed at public expense. So that's why, and since most stock, like something on the order of, don't hold me to these numbers. I don't want to quibble over the numbers, but something like 80% of the stock is owned by 1% of the people. And therefore, when you take things that were developed at public expense and hand that technology free of charge over to private companies, then that is a systemic and large-scale transfer of wealth upwards. And that's only one of the examples. Another example is what the Fed does with money. And we could do a whole episode where we get into all of the different examples. Other examples include like multinational corporations by their nature. I mean, the biggest corporations are the most skilled at shifting their costs onto the public and taking what is not theirs. And so there's another way that the power of the state is used to systematically transfer wealth from average people. And another example is whenever you have environmental pollution, especially in coal towns and oil towns, and you have big agriculture, these are obscene in their environmental degradation. And that's shifting costs onto the public, because the public either has to pay for the cleanup. Cleanup is usually impossible. And so and if you can't pay for the cleanup, then they have to deal with the consequences. We lose pollinators, we lose clean water, we are in a mass extinction, which is rapidly depleting the ecological wealth of our planet, which has dollar value in addition to having intrinsic value and inestimable value in terms of its contribution to human life. So you have all these ways in which the transfer of wealth from regular people to the very wealthy is systemic and it's large scale. And that's why you have to analyze that in order to have an intelligent and informed view of redistribution of wealth. And when people object to redistribution of wealth downwards, I submit that they're not fully considering the amount of wealth that is redistributed upwards on a large scale, systematically, all day, every day. So
you should have listened to your mother. Remember when she told you 2 wrongs don't make a right? I agree with everything you said there, I think. And but the solution to an upward wrongful redistribution is not a downward wrongful redistribution. It's to fix the system. And I agree with you.
Well, I agree that here's where we agree and here's where we don't agree on that. Where we agree is, the Hippocratic Oath, first of all, do no harm. First of all,
yep,
prove
absolutely.
harm. But the reason some people, you have a lot of Republicans who are not that rich. You have a lot of Trump supporters, and I don't think Trump is any worse than the Democratic Party, frankly. So
but the whole pro-life movement in the Republican Party is poor people objecting to the Democratic platform. But go ahead.
So you have people voting against their interests. You have because the way our media is set up and the way our education, people aren't properly informed about back when I was a Republican and a conservative, I did not understand what I just explained to you. Mm-hmm. So first of all, do no harm. Prevent the upwards redistribution, and then don't be such a candy ass when it comes to downward redistribution.
See, how does that make sense, Hart? You're complaining about the one being wrong, but you want to promote the other wrong? I don't get that.
Well, you'd have to get down to specifics. I'm not here to oversimplify everything, but I think.
Well, see, that's where you lose me. I think if it's wrong to redistribute upwards, then it's also wrong to redistribute downwards. I think the problem is we need to eliminate the redistribution. That's the problem.
Yeah, but in the meantime, so one point I'm trying to make, and probably not very well, is that if people were aware of the systematic large-scale redistribution upwards, they wouldn't have as much of a problem with the redistribution downward. Now, I don't think the downward redistribution is inherently bad or inherently evil.
So it's okay if you're Robin Hood, stealing is okay. Even if the king is not unjust, even if you fix that, it's still okay to take their stuff.
We're talking about a huge number of transactions that differ from one another. And, I think it is inherently harmful to decimate the water supply of a region through fossil fuel extraction. So that's inherently evil, and it is an instance.
No, it's not inherently evil. That's a circumstance that makes it evil. But go ahead.
It's to me. Okay. Point well taken. It is evil in and of itself, and it is an example of redistribution. So if people could see all of the redistribution that's going on, all of the different ways that it's going on, and how the power of the state is used to redistribute wealth upwards, then you wouldn't have all this hand-wringing and pearl clutching over, modest.
So we might have more people talking about the Fed.
That would be
a good thing.
That would be great.
We might have more people talking about the government benefiting the stock market when your point is well taken, like 80% of the stocks are owned by 1%.
Yeah. So,
I think you're totally right about that. And those are things that, people ought to be addressing. And instead, the conversation's about breaking windows on Market Street. We're missing the problem.
If we agree on too much, we won't have a show. So
they won't. I think we've got some stuff to mine here. We've got some digging to do. Yeah.
Well, but it is interesting how it is interesting how there's a lot to agree on across the
spectrums.
Left-right spectrum, conservative, liberal spectrum can be is overused, and it's or sometimes I don't know.
Well, if you go far enough, you end up on the other side of the planet, but joined back together.
Yeah, well, there's that. So there's a lot to talk about, and it's the Republican establishment and the Democratic establishment that don't want to it's not in their interest for us to agree on the Fed. It's not in their interest to agree on how the CARES Act benefits Wall Street at the expense of average people. So I'm Green Party, and which is neither here nor there, but I think Greens and Libertarians, or progressives and Libertarians, have a lot to talk about, because, and Libertarian broadly defined as including a great many Republicans, but they have a lot to talk about, but that conversation does not appear on cable news, or I mean, if it does, it's just silent. The media, in my view, does have the power to not talk about the issues that we would like to talk about.
There's a reason for that. G.K. Chesterton said, philosophy is a great bore. It's just thought that has been thought out.
Yeah.
The alternative is thought that has not been thought out.
Right. Right.
And so the categorization and the strictness about correct and incorrect, right and wrong, and all that stuff, that's sort of conservative stuff, when it seems to me, in my experience here, that blending it all together is sort of progressive. And I think you gain more in terms of human wisdom by applying the fundamental principles in a structured sort of a way. So I think in that sense, G.K. Chesterton was pretty much right on that. So that's why civics as a quote unquote science is really important, and economics as a quote unquote science is really important. And I think you're right. The media ignore these things. The public doesn't know them. The schools don't teach them.
Right. I remember one thing that I read G.K. Chesterton once, in fact, and he said that tradition is democracy over the course of time. It's like tradition is a kind of democracy where you take into account the wisdom of the past. And I think that's kind of what you're saying, and I would
sort of, yeah.
Well, I like saying that, I got your conservative right here. There's a lot of things that I like to conserve. I like saying that, sometimes when I'm feeling, why am I blanking here?
When you're feeling conservative?
I'm conservative in a lot of ways that count. And many people who try to identify with conservative are actually not. I mean,
touche.
Yeah.
Touche.
When you have the military Keynesianism, when you have, all the spending on the military, that it's actually undermining societies all over the world, including our own. When you have the Fed and Wall Street that are undermining societies and communities. I mean, I want to make it easier on families. I want to conserve communities. I want to get, the 70% of our economy is controlled by these Fortune 500 companies. You go up and down any street and look at the shops, almost all from out of town. And what is there about that's a community? If you want to talk about tourism.
Well, we can look in.
Go ahead.
Look in the past, in the 1200s, in the 13th century. There's a book about the 13th century. It's written in the 1800s. Oh gosh, I'll look up the title. But talking about how the average farmer in Europe in the 1200s worked 2 days a week to feed his entire family and the poor in the community. 2 days a week, Hart.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, that's what I'm talking about. Let's look at all the ways that we could reduce the cost of living. And I tend to think that we need 3 times, we're required to spend like 3 times as much as we should have. How
about interest on the debt?
Or just live. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I don't know, but you know, we're talking about these things, but until people understand what aspects are fundamental, what aspects are wrong and can be fixed, until, you know, as long as the Democrats and the Republicans can use these more shallow issues to distract all of us away from fundamental structural issues, I think we're not really going to make much progress. As long as we're focused on things like, oh, we took it away from the Native Americans and white people are bad because of it, I don't see how we move the ball with that conversation, because there really isn't much we can do about it.
I'm going to stop you there, because I think that the way you just framed it and the way you just characterized it is an example of that shallow framing that keeps, it's not your fault. I'm just saying.
What can we do about it?
No, listen. There are people that call themselves, well, the faux liberals and the faux conservatives on cable news characterize these issues in a way that's shallow, and the issues are unresolvable. So to say that white people are bad because
what's the woman that wrote the book on the Native American this issue? Oh, she's a teacher. It's not Ruth something, but anyway, I read the book. I understand the concerns. White people come across the ocean and take over land from a functioning economic system among the Native Americans. I get all that. And right now, yes, we have bad things happening with reservations and leaving them to get drunk and run casinos, and that's all they really get. I think those are bad things. But I live in Louisville, Kentucky, and I would hope that the Hart Hagans that are over in the Midwest or West are active in these issues. And frankly, I'd be interested in seeing Congress doing things that would fix the issues. But my biggest problem right now is I'm in Louisville, Kentucky, with the black community outraged at the white community, and the police blamed for a lot of it, and I don't know what to do about that, much less do I have time to figure out what to do about something going on out west. I don't think I'm going to sign my property over to the nearest Native American I can find. I don't see how that makes any sense. I didn't steal it from them. I bought it from the guy who had it before me, and maybe it goes back a few hundred years, and maybe they did something like that. And, but again, if we never let go of our problems, then we will never have the freedom and peace that comes from forgiveness. Current oppression, let's deal with. So if you got somebody in the community that's being oppressed because they're Native American, let's deal with it.
Right.
And if you got somebody, frankly, if you got somebody that's suffering racism right now, I'm a lawyer, okay? Yeah. Have them call me. Let's make some money on it.
Right.
But you know, at the same time, I do a lot of pro bono work. In fact, I probably do at least as much as any other lawyer,
probably
maybe more. And so, well, I'm just saying that number one, I can't fix every problem. Right. Number two, I got a lot of problems on my plate that are really kind of intense, like the systematic execution of black people at the abortion clinic. That seems to me to be a fairly high priority. I think we need to end abortion in this country. Why would we follow the example of Margaret Sanger and Planned Parenthood, who were following examples of the Nazis, frankly? You know, I think people need to be educated on that, and we've
got a minute left.
Yeah, well, that's a whole show in itself. So I don't know where you're coming from when you say we're running out of things to talk about because we agree.
I'm
anyway.
kidding.
Yeah. All right. Well, I do appreciate the chance to talk with you, Hart.
It's my pleasure. Let's do it again soon.
Okay. And when does this air? When do these shows air?
It's every evening at 7 p.m. on 106.5. And of course, if you have a link to the YouTube version, you can watch that as well.
There we go.
Okay,
good to be with you, Hart.
Good to talk to you. Bye-bye.
Bye.